History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 3. The Classical Mediterranean. Measured in years, more than half the story of civilization is over by about 500 BC. We are still nearer to that date than were the men who lived then to their first civilized predecessors. In the 3000 or so years between them, humanity had come a long way. However imperceptibly slow the changes of daily life in them had been, there is an enormous qualitative gap between Sumer and Achaemenid Persia. By the 6th century, a great period of foundation and acceleration was already over. From the western Mediterranean to the coasts of China, a variety of cultural traditions had established themselves. Distinct civilizations had taken root in them, some firmly and deeply enough to survive into our own era. Some of them lasted, moreover, with little but superficial and temporary change for hundreds or even thousands of years. Virtually isolated, they contributed little to mankind's shared life outside their own areas. For the most part, even the greatest centers of civilization were indifferent to what lay outside their spheres for at least 2000 years after the fall of Babylon, except when troubled by the occasional invasion. Only one of the civilizations already discernible by the 6th century BC, in fact, showed much potential for expanding beyond its cradle, that of the eastern Mediterranean. It was the youngest of them, but was to be very successful, lasting for over 1,000 years without a break in its tradition. Even this is less remarkable than what is left behind, though, for it was the seedbed of almost all that played a dynamic part in shaping the world we still inhabit. Chapter 1. The Roots of One World. The appearance of a new civilization in the eastern Mediterranean owed much to the older Near Eastern and Asian traditions. From the start, we confront an amalgam of Greek speech, a Semitic alphabet, ideas whose roots lie in Egypt and Mesopotamia, and reminiscences of Mycenae. Even when this civilization matured, it showed the diversity of its origins. It was never to be a simple monolithic whole, and in the end was very complex indeed. For all that integrated it and gave it unity, it was always hard to delimit a cluster of similar cultures around the Mediterranean and Aegean, their frontier zones blurring far outwards into Asia, Africa, barbarian Europe, and southern Russia. Even when its boundaries with them were clear, other traditions always played upon Mediterranean civilization and received much from it. This civilization also varied in time. It showed greater powers of evolution than any of its predecessors. Even when they had undergone important political changes, their institutions remained fundamentally intact. While Mediterranean civilization displays a huge variety of transient political forms and experiments in religion and ideology, whereas other traditions tended to develop without violent changes or breaks, so that civilization and religion were virtually terminus, the one living and dying with the other. Mediterranean civilization begins in a native paganism and ends by succumbing to an exotic import, Christianity, a revolutionized Judaism, which was to be the first global religion. This was a huge change and it transformed this civilization's possibilities of influencing the future. Of all the forces making for its crystallization, the most fundamental was the setting itself, the Mediterranean basin. It was both a collecting area and a source. Currents flowed easily into it from the lands of the old civilizations, and from this central reservoir, they also flowed back to where they came from and northwards into the barbarian lands. Though it is large and contains a large variety of peoples, this basin has well defined general characteristics. Most of its coasts are narrow plains behind which quickly rise fairly steep and enclosing mountain ranges, broken by a few important rivers. Those who lived on the coasts tended to look along them and outward across the sea, rather than behind them to their hinterland. This combined with a climate they all shared, made the spreading of ideas and techniques within the Mediterranean natural for enterprising peoples. The Romans, with reason, named the Mediterranean Mare Magnum, the Great Sea. It was the outstanding geographical fact of their world, the center of classical maps. Its surface was a great uniting force for those who knew how to use it, and by 500 BC, maritime technology was advanced enough to make this possible, except in winter. Prevailing winds and currents determined the exact routes of ships, whose only power was provided by sails or oars, but any part of the Mediterranean was accessible by water from any other. The upshot was a literal civilization with few languages spoken widely within it. It had specialized trading centers for exchanges of materials were easy by sea, but the economy rested firmly on the growing of wheat and barley, olives and vines, mainly for local consumption. The metals increasingly needed by this economy could be brought in from outside. The desert to the south were held at bay, further from the coast, and for perhaps thousands of years. North Africa was richer than it now is, more heavily wooded, better watered, and more fertile. The same sort of civilization, therefore, tended to appear all around the Mediterranean. Such a difference between Africa and Europe, as we take for granted, did not exist until after 500 AD. The outward looking peoples of this littoral civilization created a new world. The Great Valley civilizations had not colonized, they had conquered. Their peoples looked inwards to the satisfaction of limited aims under the local despots. Many later societies within the classical world were to do the same, but there is a discernible change of tempo and potential from the start, and eventually Greeks and Romans grew corn in Russia, worked tin from Cornwall, built roads into the Balkans, and enjoyed spices from India and silk from China. About this world, we know a great deal, partly because it left behind a huge archaeological and monumental legacy. Much more important, though, is the new richness of written material. With this, we enter the era of full literacy. Among other things, we confront the first true works of history, important as were to be the great folk records of the Jews, the narrations of a cosmic drama built about the pilgrimage of one people through time. They are not critical history. In any case, they too reach us through the classical Mediterranean world. Without Christianity, their influence would have been limited to Israel, though the myths they presented, and the possibilities of meanings they offered were to be injected into a world with 400 years of what we can recognize as critical writing of history already behind it. Yet the work of ancient historians, important as it was, is only a tiny part of the record. Soon after 500 BC, we are in the presence of the first complete great literature, ranging from drama to epic, lyric, hymn, history, and epigram. Though what is left of it is only a small part. Seven out of more than 100 plays by its greatest tragedian, for example. Nevertheless, It enables us to enter the mind of a civilization as we can enter that of none earlier. Even for Greece, of course, the source of this literature, and fortiori for other and more remote parts of the classical world. The written record is not enough on its own. The archaeology is indispensable, but it is all the more informative because literary sources are so much fuller than anything from the early past. The record they offer us is for the most part in Greek or Latin, the two languages which provided the intellectual currency of Mediterranean civilization. The persistence in English, the most widely used of languages today, of so many words drawn from them, is by itself almost enough evidence to show this civilization's importance to its successors. All seven nouns in the last sentence, but one, for example, are based on Latin words. It was through writings in these languages that later men approached this civilization, and in them they detected the qualities which made them speak of what they found simply as classical world. This is a perfectly proper usage, provided we remember that the men who coined it were heirs to the traditions they saw in it and stood perhaps trapped within its assumptions. Other traditions and civilizations too have had their classical phases. What it means is that men see in some part of the past an age setting standards for later times. Many later Europeans were to be hypnotized by the power and glamour of classical Mediterranean civilization. Some men who lived in it, too, thought that their culture and times, were exceptional, though not always for reasons we should now find convincing. Yet it was exceptional, vigorous, and restless. It provided standards and ideals as well as technology and institutions on which huge futures were to be built. In essence, the unity later discerned by those who admired the Mediterranean heritage was a mental one. Inevitably, there was to be much anachronistic falsification in some of the later efforts to study and utilize the classical ideal, and much romanticization of a lost age too. Yet, even when this is discounted and when the classical past has undergone the skeptical scrutiny of scholars, there remains a big, indissoluble residue of intellectual achievement which somehow places it on our side of a mental boundary, while the great empires of Asia lie beyond it. With whatever difficulty and possibility of misconstruction, the mind of the classical age is recognizable and comprehensible in a way perhaps nothing earlier can be. This, it has been said well, is a world whose air we can breathe. The role of the Greeks was preeminent in making this world, and with them, its story must begin. They contributed more than any other single people to its dynamism and to its mythical and inspirational legacy. The Greeks' search for excellence defined for later nations what excellence was, and their achievement remains difficult to exaggerate. It is the core of the process which made classical Mediterranean civilization. Chapter 2. The Greeks. In the second half of the 18th century BC, the clouds which had hidden the Aegean since the end of the Bronze Age began to part a little. Processes and sometimes events become somewhat more discernible. There is even a date or two, one of which is important in the history of a civilization's self consciousness. In 776 BC, according to later Greek historians, the first Olympian Games were held. After a few centuries, the Greeks would count from this year as we count from the birth of the Christ. The people who gathered for that and later festivals of the same sort recognized by doing so that they shared a culture. Its basis was a common language. Dorians, Ionians, Aeolians all speak Greek. What is more, they had done so for a long time. The language was now to acquire the definition which comes from being written down. An enormously important development making possible, for example, the recording of the traditional oral poetry, which was said to be the work of Homer. Our first surviving inscription in Greek characters is on a jug of about 750 BC. It shows how much the renewal of Asian civilization owed to Asia. The inscription is written in an adaptation of Phoenician script. Greeks were illiterate until their traders brought home this alphabet. It seems to have been used first in the Peloponnese, Crete, and Rhodes. Possibly, these were the first areas to benefit from the renewal of intercourse with Asia after the Dark Ages. The process is mysterious and can probably never be recovered, but somehow the catalyst which precipitated Greek civilization was contact with the East. Who were the Greek speakers who attended the first Olympiad? Though it is the name by which they and their descendants are still known, they were not called Greeks. That name was only given them centuries later by the Romans. The word they would have used was one we render in English as Hellenes, first used to distinguish invaders of the Greek peninsula from their earlier inhabitants. It became one applied to all the Greek speaking peoples of the Aegean. This was the new conception and the new emerging from the Dark Ages, and there is more than a verbal significance to it. It expressed a consciousness of a new entity, one still emerging and one whose exact meaning would always remain uncertain. Some of the Greek speakers had in the 18th century already long been settled and their roots were lost in the turmoil of the Bronze Age invasions. Some were much more recent arrivals. None came as Greeks. They became Greeks by being there, all around the Aegean. Language identified them and wove new ties between them. Together with a shared heritage of religion and myth, it was the most important constituent of being Greek, always and supremely a matter of common culture. Yet, such ties were never politically effective. They were unlikely to make for unity because of the size and shape of the theatre of Greek history, which was not what we now call Greece, but was rather the whole Aegean. The widespread of Minoan and Mycenaean influences in earlier civilized times had foreshadowed this, for between the scores of its islands and the shores which closed about them, it was easy to voyage during much of the year. The explanation of the appearance of Greek civilization at all may well be largely a matter of this geography. The past certainly counted for something too, but Minoan Crete and Mycenae probably left less to Greece than Anglo Saxon England left for a later Great Britain. The setting was more important than history, for it made possible a cluster of economically viable communities, using the same language and easily accessible, not only to one another but to older centers of civilization in the Near East. Like the old river valleys, but for different reasons. The Aegean was a propitious place for civilization making. Much of the Aegean was settled by Greeks as a consequence of limitations and opportunities that they found on the mainland. Only in very small patches did its land and climate combine to offer the chance of agricultural plenty. For the most part, cultivation was confined to narrow strips of alluvial plain, which had to be dry farmed, framed by rocky or wooded hills. Minerals were rare. There was no tin, copper, or iron. A few valleys ran directly to the sea, and communication between them was usually difficult. All this inclined the inhabitants of Attica and the Peloponnese to look outward to the sea, on the surface of which movement was much easier than on land. None of them, after all, lived more than 40 miles from it. This predisposition was intensified as early as the 10th century by a growth of population which brought greater pressure on available land. Ultimately, this led to a great age of colonization by the end of it, in the 6th century. The Greek world stretched far beyond the Aegean, from the Black Sea in the east to the Balearics, France and Sicily in the west, and Libya in the south. But this was the result of centuries during which forces other than population pressure had also been at work. While Thrace was colonized by agriculturalists looking for land, other Greeks settled in the Levant or South Italy in order to trade, whether for the wealth it would bring or for the access it offered to the metals they needed and could not find in Greece. Some Black Sea Greek cities seem to be where they are because of trade, some because of their farming potential. Nor were traders and farmers the only agents diffusing Greek ways and teaching Greece about the outside world. The historical records of other countries shows us that there was a supply of Greek mercenaries available from the 6th century when they fought for the Egyptians against the Assyrians onwards. All these facts were to have important social and political repercussions on the Greek homeland. Despite serving in foreign armies and quarreling violently among themselves, while cherishing the traditional and emotional distinctions of Boeotian or Dorian or Ionian, the Greeks were always very conscious that they were different from other peoples. This could be practically important. Greek prisoners of war, for examples, were in theory not to be enslaved, unlike barbarians. This word expressed self conscious Hellenism in its essence, but is more inclusive and less dismissive than it is in modern speech. The barbarians were the rest of the world, those who did not speak an intelligible Greek dialect, though it might be, but who made a sort of bar noise which no Greek could understand. The great religious festivals of the Greek year, when people from many cities came together, were occasions to which only the Greek speaker was admitted. Religion was the other foundation of Greek identity. The Greek pantheon is enormously complex, the amalgam of a mass of myths created by many communities over a wide area of different times, often incoherent or even self contradictory until ordered by later rationalizing minds. Some were imports like the Asian myth of golden, silver, bronze, and iron ages. Local superstition and belief in such legends was the bedrock of the Greek religious experience. Yet it was a religious experience very different from that of other peoples in its ultimately humanizing tendency. Greek gods and goddesses, for all their supernatural standing and power, are remarkably human. Much as they owed to Egypt and the East, Greek mythology and art usually present their gods as better or worse men and women, a world away from the monsters of Assyria and Babylonia, or from Shiva and the armed. This was a religious revolution. Its converse was the implication that men could be godlike. It is already apparent in Homer. Perhaps he did as much as anyone to order the Greek supernatural in this way, and he does not give much space to the popular cults. He presents the gods taking sides in the Trojan War in postures all too human and competing with one another. While Poseidon harries the hero of the Odyssey, Athena takes his place. A later Greek critic grumbled that Homer attributed to the gods everything that is disgraceful and blameworthy. Among men, theft, adultery, and deceit. It was a world which operated much like the actual world. The Iliad and Odyssey have already been touched upon because of the light they throw on prehistory. They were also shapers of the future. They are, at first sight, curious objects for a people's reverence. The Iliad gives an account of a short episode from a legendary, long past war. The Odyssey is more like a novel, narrating the wandering of one of the greatest of all literary characters. Odysseus, on his way home from the same struggle. That, on the face of it, is all. But they came to be held to be something like sacred books. If, as seems reasonable, the survival rate of early copies is thought to give a true reflection of relative popularity, they were copied more frequently than any other text of Greek literature. Much time and ink have been spent on argument about how they were composed. It now seems more likely that they took their present shape in Ionia, slightly before 700 BC. The Greeks referred to their author without qualification as the poet, a sufficient sign of his standing in their eyes. But some have found arguments for thinking the two poems are the work of different men. For our purpose, it is unimportant whether he was one author or not. The essential point is that someone took material presented by 4 centuries of bardic transmission and wove it into a form which acquired stability, and in this sense, these works are the culmination of an era of Greek heroic poetry. Though they were probably written down in the 7th century, no standard version of these poems was accepted until the 6th. By then, they were already regarded as the authoritative account of early Greek history, a source of morals and models, and the staple of literary education. Thus, they became not only the first documents of Greek self consciousness, but the embodiment of the fundamental values of classical civilization. Later, they were to be even more than this. Together with the Bible, they became the source of Western literature. Human though Homer's god might be, the Greek world had also a deep respect for the occult and mysterious. It was recognized in such embodiments as omens and oracles. The shrines of the oracles of Apollo and Delphi, or at Didyma in Asia Minor, were places of pilgrimage and the sources of respected, if enigmatic, advice. There were ritual cults which practiced mysterious, which reenacted the great natural processes of germination and growth at the passage of the seasons. Popular religion does not loom large in the literary sources, but it was never wholly separated from respectable religion. It is important to remember this irrational subsoil, given that the achievements of the Greek elite during the later classical era are so impressive and rest so importantly on rationality and logic. The irrational was always there, and in the earlier formative period with which this chapter is concerned, it loomed large. The literary record and accepted tradition also reveal something, if nothing very precise, of the social and, if the word is appropriate, political institutions of early Greece. Homer shows us a society of kings and aristocrats, but one already anachronistic when he depicted it. The title of king sometimes lived on and in one place, Sparta, where there were always two kings at once. It had a shadowy reality which sometimes was effective. But by historical times, power had passed from monarchs to aristocracies in almost all the Greek cities. The Council of the Areopagus at Athens is an example of the sort of restricted body which usurped the kingly power in many places. Such ruling elites rested fundamentally on land. Their members were the outright owners of the estates, which provided not only their livelihood but the surplus for the expensive arms and horses which made leaders in war. Homer depicts such aristocrats behaving with a remarkable degree of independence of his kings. This probably reflects the reality of his own day. They were the only people who counted. Other social distinctions have little importance in these poems. Thersites is properly chastised for infringing the crucial line between gentlemen and the rest.